Now we can get to our time frame. 35 years ago, Wednesday, 23 March 1988. The local population have largely left because of the intense fighting that had waged in the general area over the past 6 months, starting in September 1987. Fapla's offensive from Mavinga have been stopped, and the Fapla force partly destroyed have been pushed right back to the very banks of the Quito River by combined South African and UNITA forces to dig in for a final stand at the Tumpo Triangle. By now, the Soviet advisors who had gotten Fapla into this failed offensive have all been evacuated by helicopter, and the Cubans have taken over, under the direct command of Fidel Castro himself, all the way from Havana. His men on the ground are Cuban General Arnoldo T. Ojua Sanchez, who has been involved in the Cuban International Mission in Angola since 1975, and the field commander of Cuban forces in Angola, General Leopoldo Polo Cintras Frias. While General Ojua was not physically present at Quito Carnival at this time, he was nominally in charge. All things Cuban were taken care of by General Frias, and he also organized the Fapla Cuban defenses in the area of dispute. The field commander of the Fapla forces at Quito Carnival, leading the Angolans from the forward command post of the 6th Military Region, was Major José Domingos Baptista Cordeiro Nguetu. As to the strength and organization of the Cuban Fapla forces at Quito Carnival at this stage, the following. Originally, in August 1987, the offensive forces comprised of the following Fapla brigades: 47 Brigade, 59 Brigade, and Tactical Group 1 attacking on the right flank, 16 Brigade, 21 Brigade, and Tactical Group 2 attacking on the left flank, 25 Brigade, 66 Brigade kept in reserve, 13 Brigade and 36 Brigade protecting the southern and northern flanks of Quito Carnival on the west side of the Quito and Carnival rivers, 8 Brigade escorting and protecting the convoys coming in from Manong. Thus a total of 9 brigades, each with between 5 and 22 tanks, with between 1100 and 1900 men each, and 2 tactical groups each with 10 tanks and a battalion of some 450 men. All of these have attached artillery, every brigade with a battalion of at least 18 guns or rocket launchers, as well as mobile air defense batteries such as SA-8, SA-9 or SA-13. This was roughly a total of some 130 tanks, 4 battalions worth, 14,500 men, which is 27 battalions, and some 180 guns or rocket launchers, which are 36 batteries. A Cuban regiment of about 1,500 men, that's about 3 battalions plus attachments, should be added to this total, although they did not form part of the initial offensive. Note, there were no SWAPO or ANC combat elements. By March 1988, having failed in their bid to capture Mavinga, and having been pushed back to the very banks of the Quito River, while making a fighting withdrawal, 47 Brigade and Tactical Group 1 were both utterly destroyed during the Battle of the Lomba River on 3 October, a mere 200 plus survivors making their way back to 66 Brigade. As each brigade made a stand against the onslaught of aggressive SADF UNITA forces, they were in turn driven out of their positions with high losses. 16 Brigade at the Shambinga source on 11 November 1987, 21 Brigade on 2 and 13 January 1988, and finally with 59 Brigade on 14 February 1988. Again with survivors falling back, but this time with their equipment to be absorbed into the remaining brigades as reinforcements, after losing some 4,763 men, 94 tanks, and hundreds of trucks and other military equipment, including some highly specialized air defense systems and radars. This left the Fapla force with roughly 9,000 men and some 36 plus tanks, after having received reinforcements from Manong, plus the 1,500 odd Cubans. Of the original 9 brigades, only 8 brigade on the lines of communication, 2 battalions of 13 Brigade and a battalion of 36 Brigade on the west side of the Quito and Guanavala rivers, and 3 battalions each of 66 Brigade and 25 Brigade on the east side, with a tactical group of 14 tanks remained, the equivalent of 4 full brigades if you counted by battalion. The average number of men per battalion was plus minus 600 because of having absorbed the survivors of the depleted and now defunct brigades. This included attached elements which would have become available from the brigade level, such as artillery, with all battalions now falling directly under the command of the forward command post at Quito Cuernaval. Considering that 8th Brigade was kept busy on the lines of communication between Manong and Quito Cuernaval, this reduced the number of battalions available for the total defense of Quito Cuernaval to 9, which is some 5,400 men, of which 6 battalions, about 3,600 men, were dug in on the eastern side of the Quito River in a so-called Tumpo Triangle. Around 800 Cuban soldiers were used to bolster the numbers of the defending 6 battalions in the Tumpo Triangle. General Ojwa had nominally placed the 2 Angolan brigades, 25 and 66, under the command of Colonel Hector Aguilar and Colonel Joachim Soria, respectively, and the tank brigade was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Ciro Gonzalez. Of the 36 plus tanks, at least 10 were not mobile and were dug into hull-down positions from where they could at least fire. A mixture of a few T-34, but mostly T-54 or T-55 tanks. 14 fully mobile tanks, probably all T-55s, were organized together as a mobile reserve in a tactical group formed by the Cuban 3-tank battalion, and the remaining 10 plus tanks taking up mobile positions on either side of the Quito Bridge on the high grounds west of the river. The Cuban Fapla force's big strength lay in the number of artillery guns and launchers available, with the divisional and surviving brigade-level artillery becoming available for use. Many of the brigade-level artillery had been destroyed in the previous battles, but at least half of the guns and launchers made it back to the Tumpo defenses, this alone being about 24 guns of various calibers, mostly 76 and 122 millimeters, and at least 21 serviceable 122 millimeter BM-21 multiple rocket launchers. They had lost 27 BM-21s up to this point. Add to this the plus minus 44 surviving guns of the 4 brigades still on the front, and at least 10 130 millimeter divisional guns, they had lost 2, another 12 122 millimeter howitzers, and 6 122 millimeter BM-21s. They could therefore deploy a total of plus minus 90 guns and 27 launchers at the very least, excluding the 6 to 8 82 millimeter or 120 millimeter mortars that each combat battalion had. This was still some formidable firepower which, if used correctly, could swing the fortunes of war in our area in dispute. How was a typical Fapla motorized brigade organized, and how strong was it? Well, to be honest, the results of this competition is still out there, and we may never really know. Basically, the brigade consisted of 3 infantry battalions, a tank company, an air defense battery comprising either of SA-9, SA-13 or SA-8 surface-to-air missile systems, an artillery battalion with 3 batteries, 1 or 2 of either D-30 120mm guns or ZIS-3 76mm guns, 1 of BM-21 122mm multiple rocket launchers, or optionally 120mm mortars. Reconnaissance, engineers, recovery and supply, medical, signals, maintenance, etc. elements are also usually added. For the purposes of comparison, I'm going to be looking at the organization of a typical brigade from 3 angles. Firstly, as the fully functional, fully equipped, fully staffed, but theoretical formation, as we were taught to expect of the what we called Antissa forces at our corps schools and military colleges. Secondly, as a theoretical but most probable formation as the start of Operatio Saludando Octubre in August 1987. And thirdly, as a reinforced formation after the depleted brigades had been absorbed into the remaining brigades for the defense in the Tumpo Triangle during January to June 1988. The Theoretical Brigade. This formation is quite a monster with theoretically over 2,200 officers and men on strength. It would have comprised of a brigade headquarters, 3 infantry battalions, a tank battalion, and an artillery battalion. Note the number and types of vehicles such a brigade would have had, and this excludes any air defense, reconnaissance, and engineer elements, which would still be attached. No wonder we were told that we were facing some 20,000 enemy soldiers at Quito Guanaval. The infantry battalion with over 500 men would comprise of a battalion headquarters and 3 companies, each company comprising of 3 platoons of 29 men, an anti-tank platoon, an air defense section, and an automatic grenade launcher section. The tank battalion of 31 tanks with 165 men would comprise of a battalion headquarters, 3 tank companies, each with 10 tanks, and a service platoon. The artillery battalion with more than 400 men would comprise of a battalion headquarters with platoon, 222mm howitzer batteries, 2 76mm field gun batteries, a battery of 122mm multiple rocket launchers, a battery of 120mm mortars, with a maintenance platoon. The command elements of the individual units of the typical Angolan brigade was also much reduced, as they simply did not have trained officers for each and every command level. This meant that, for example, captains and sometimes even first lieutenants were in command of an entire 1,000-plus man brigade. Examples are Captain Dimas, the commander of the 47th Brigade, Captain Hisenjelekwa, commander of the 59th Brigade, Captain Kangamba, commander of the 66th Brigade, Captain Kiluanga Ekeba, commander of the 13th Brigade, Captain Ngueleka, commander of the 21st Brigade, Captain Nzenzeka, commander of the 8th Brigade, Captain Abaladu, commander of the 16th Brigade, and Captain Antonio Valeriano, commander of the 25th Infantry Brigade. This meant that majors commanded the forward command posts and subgroupings. For example, Major Tobias Domingos was the commander of the Fapla subgrouping, comprising of the 47th Brigade, 59th Brigade, and the 2nd Tactical Group at the Lomba. In fact, the commander of all the Angolan ground forces at the command post at Quito Carnaval was a major, Major Ngwetu Cordero, sometimes also referred to as Comandante Ngwentu. This meant that first lieutenants and second lieutenants were actually in command of the different battalions of around 400 men, and that all lower level command functions were taken care of by NCOs. The most probable brigade. It is a by now well-known fact that a typical Fapla brigade in 1987 started out as a rather under-strength formation as compared to its theoretical strength. This was due to previous attrition during combat with UNITA guerrillas up to that point, desertion, sickness, recruitment, reinforcement, and training issues. This fact has been confirmed by a number of Soviet advisors, which I now count among my friends, as well as feedback from Angolan and Cuban veterans. The reduced tank battalion of only 21 tanks, with only 110 men, would comprise of a battalion headquarters with 1 tank, 2 tank companies of 10 tanks each, and a small supply platoon. The reduced infantry battalion with only about 365 men would comprise of a battalion headquarters and 3 companies, each company comprising of 3 platoons of 25 men, an anti-tank platoon with 2 57mm or 76mm guns, sometimes an air defense section, and a mortar battery with 6 82mm mortars. The reduced artillery battalion with no more than 230 men would comprise of a battalion headquarters, 122mm howitzer battery with 60 men, one 76mm field gun battery with 60 men, and a battery of 122mm multiple rocket launchers with 60 men. When you now look at the reduced number of just these basic building blocks of the reduced brigade, you will see that there were no more than around 1,400 men in the brigade. That is less than 2/3 of the theoretical size. Thirdly, the reinforced brigades were, simply put, the surviving reduced brigades bolstered with the remnants and survivors and recovered equipment of the depleted brigades. Basically, this meant absorbing enough men and equipment for an additional company of 4 platoons and a fourth platoon to each existing company in every battalion. So each infantry battalion's strength were increased with about 185 men, resulting in each infantry battalion now having an average strength of about 550. With another 150 additional men per brigade to man the extra guns recovered from the depleted brigades, an entire additional battery could have been added to each of the 6 brigades on the front. As already indicated, the defensive deployment was personally supervised by the Cuban contingent at Cuito. Let us briefly look at the Cuban defensive doctrine, which was strictly adhered to in this case. It is worth noting that the organization of a Fapla brigade is more or less similar to that of the Cuban infantry regiment, i.e., it comprised mainly of 3 infantry battalions, 350 to 550 men each, an artillery battalion with 3 batteries, a total of 18 guns of launchers, but only a sometimes reinforced company of tanks, 10 to 15 tanks, as opposed to the Cuban infantry regiment, which had a battalion of 21 tanks. Attached elements such as engineers, air defense, reconnaissance, medical, recovery, logistics, etc. were standard. Elements of the Cuban regiment were attached to the Angolan brigades in order to boost morale, advise, and provide support right down to ground level. The Cuban 3-tank battalion was kept as a mobile reserve. The Cuban military stressed the importance of artillery in combat operations, and commanders placed heavy emphasis on artillery preparations. They had limited direction finding, DF, intercept and jamming capabilities, and could be expected to employ some DF equipment and jamming devices. They would probably implement deception measures, such as establishing dummy radio nets. Air reconnaissance was an important source of combat intelligence. Pilots could report targets directly by radio to ground forces. The Cuban Air Force had tactical photographic and infrared capabilities. In combat situations, every unit was expected to establish observation posts, OPs. These posts would have had wire communications. Division OPs may operate up to 5 kilometers forward of the forward edge of a battle area, FIBA. I'll say that again, forward edge of the battle area, FIBA. Artillery target acquisition elements would contain counter-battery radars, radio direction finding equipment, and sound ranging devices. Normal reaction time to effectively engage targets located by visual means would be about 30 minutes. Artillery units would be allocated to support maneuver units as required. Artillery would be placed in direct support of first echelon elements. Second echelon units were not to be allocated direct artillery support until they were committed. Formal fire plans were detailed and meticulous, and control was retained at the highest practical headquarters. On completion of initial fires, the control of the artillery units was decentralized. Artillery was organized into temporary tactical groups to provide the fire support required by the tactical situation. These groups were regimental artillery groups, RAGs, in which existing regimental artillery units were augmented by divisional or higher artillery assets. A RAG was normally composed of at least 2 artillery battalions. The RAGs support maneuver battalions or regiments and are located well forward. With the Angolans making up the bulk of the troops organized in brigades rather than regiments, we might as well call these brigade artillery groups, BAGs, in which the existing artillery battalions were used. Division artillery groups, DAGs, in which division artillery units were augmented by higher artillery assets. A DAG was normally composed of several artillery battalions. The DAGs, usually composed of long-range artillery and multiple rocket launchers, were located further back than the RAGs and support either regiments or divisions. The Angolan higher artillery assets simply comprised of an additional battalion of 1230mm field guns, 1222mm howitzers, and 622mm multiple rocket launchers directly under the command of the forward control post, which did not maneuver with any single brigade, but were deployed on the western high grounds at Cuita. I believe most of these weapons were from the 8th Brigade, whose main task was escorting and safeguarding the convoys coming in from Manong, and therefore had no need of artillery, being too mobile all the time. 6 artillery pieces comprised an artillery battery, and 3 artillery batteries comprised a battalion. Each battery was normally positioned in a line along 200 to 300 meters of frontage, and the batteries were deployed in a triangle with about 1 kilometer separating each battery. While artillery communications were adequate, a radio link was seldom established with a supporting unit, and the Cubans usually depended instead on the co-location of the artillery commander with a supported commander. Forward observers were deployed as well ahead with the frontline battalions. Field and anti-tank guns towed by wheeled and tracked prime movers had a good long-range performance. If warranted by a tank threat, organic artillery would be employed in the anti-tank role. High-velocity guns were equipped with armor-piercing ammunition. Lower-velocity weapons with shape charge. Anti-tank fire planning was detailed and coordinated at the highest possible level. Tanks and tank approaches would be covered by mutually supporting anti-tank weapons in depth. Regiment and division anti-tank reserves are task organized for both the offensive and the defense. These reserves are normally made up of both guns and tanks, and in defensive situations frequently include engineers for obstacle support. The role of an anti-tank reserve is to deploy rapidly to meet tank threats. Cuban tactical air support to ground forces, compared with Western and Soviet armies, is limited in quantity and quality, but has received increased emphasis during recent years. Cuba's close air support aircraft inventory includes both fighter aircraft and armed helicopters. Fighter aircraft normally operate in pairs or in multiples of pairs. Attacks can be made with conventional bombs, napalm, cannon, or rockets. Aircraft approach the target at high speeds, and at a readily recognized identification point, the pilot normally will pull up to identify the target. The pilot will then execute a dive, which can be steep or shallow, to release his load. Although a pull-up at a recognized point is normal procedure, low-level rocket attacks cannot be discounted. The Army or Corps headquarters will normally retain control of allocated close air sorties, assigning them as necessary. Air liaison officers and forward air controllers are deployed with divisions to coordinate the air support of ground operations. There were more than 50 MiG-23 aircraft at Manong, as well as a helicopter regiment of Mi-17 HIP and Mi-25 Hinds. While at least one MiG-23 squadron was tasked for air defense and interceptor roles, the bulk of these aircraft were used in a supporting ground attack role. This was due to the Angolan Air Force enjoying air superiority over the Cuita battlefields due to their proximity to the town, only 180 kilometers to the west. I remember counting 11 MiGs in the air above me on the Sunday, 27 March 1988, only 4 days after the Tumpo 3 attack. Air mobile troops, a component of the assault and landing troops, could be employed in operations such as seizing either key targets in rear areas or lines of communications, and they could be used for reconnaissance and raiding missions behind the FIBA. Cuba had practiced conducting air mobile operations in several military exercises using armed Mi-4 Hound and Mi-8 HIP helicopters. Helicopters were especially vulnerable to the 155mm artillery fire of the South Africans because of the proximity fuses used that caused shells to explode some 30 meters above the ground. Even armored helicopters like the Hind could not withstand an explosion above it that sprayed white-hot shrapnel into all the vulnerable unarmored top parts of the helicopter. While air mobile operations were very successfully conducted against the UNITA guerrillas elsewhere in Angola, it was soon very clear to both the Soviet advisors and the Cubans that this type of operation could not effectively be used against the South Africans. The helicopter regiment, which was originally deployed about 17 kilometers west of Cuba, were quickly withdrawn to Manong once it was discovered that the 155 millimeter artillery of the South Africans could reach even that far. Air defense missions included protecting headquarters elements, supply and communications facilities, and major installations. Cuba had a target acquisition and warning system which provided air defense units with targets and combat units with early warning. The system, however, was based primarily on older Soviet radars, which could have had a limited effectiveness against a modern air force. In our Angolan area in dispute, this was fully augmented by some of the most modern radar systems supplied by the Soviets. Cuba's air surveillance forces were equipped with various Soviet radars, including the fan song, tall king, flat face, spoon rest, and bar lock. I will resist the temptation to discuss the specifications, advantages and disadvantages of each individual radar system, but it will at least list them and show the basic recognizable profiles of most of them. The fan song engagement radar, the tall king acquisition radar, the flat face acquisition radar, the spoon rest acquisition radar, the bar lock acquisition radar. Air defense officers at regiment and above were responsible for air defense planning and were under the operational control of the ground unit commander for deployment and combat control. Cuba had a wide variety of air defense weapons. In addition to the towed and self-propelled guns, it had the SA-2 Guideline, SA-3 Gua, SA-7 Grail surface-to-air missiles. Furthermore, the Cuban army had numerous machine guns and other small arms which would be used in an air defense role. With Soviet arms and supplies flowing in, some of the latest surface-to-air missile systems were deployed in our area in dispute, including mobile systems such as the SA-6, SA-9, SA-13, and one of the most recent integrated systems, the SA-8. Again, I will resist the temptation to discuss the specifications, advantages and disadvantages of each individual system, but will at least list them and show their basic recognizable profiles. The SA-7 Grail, SA-14 and SA-16 shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile systems. The SA Guideline surface-to-air missile system. The SA-3 Gua surface-to-air missile system. The SA-6 Gainful surface-to-air missile system. The SA-9 Gascon surface-to-air missile system. The SA-13 Gopher surface-to-air missile system. And the SA-8 Gecko surface-to-air missile system. In the Cuban tactical doctrine, the basic form of the defense was the area defense, in which major commanders were ordered to defend within a certain area until relieved by higher authority. It was organized in depth and designed to deny key terrain to the enemy, to halt his attack, and to inflict significant losses. Forward units engaged the enemy decisively and held at all costs with no thought of withdrawing to successive defensive positions. The basic form of Cuban defense was the area defense, in which major commanders, division and above, were ordered to defend within a certain area until relieved by higher authority. The commanders usually were allowed to position their units within the designated area. The area defense was characterized by detailed and extensive planning, and defensive positions were planned in depth. It was designed to provide a stubborn defense in order to halt the enemy while inflicting significant losses on his men and material. The infantry units usually were ordered to engage the enemy decisively and almost always were ordered to hold at all costs with no thought of withdrawal. The Cubans used two types of defense, the deliberate and the hasty. The hasty defense is most often utilized when the Cubans had very little time to organize a defense, or when the advance guard of the first echelon units were stopped in their offensive action. The deliberate defense was organized whenever the Cubans had several hours or more to organize a defensive position, or whenever the advance was going to be halted for more than a few hours. In our scenario, the Cuban Fapla forces has had months to prepare their defenses in the area of dispute. So, in effect, in terms of the Cuban defensive doctrine, it was textbook deliberate area defense. The major differences were the size of the sectors and the location of the tank assets. In the hasty defense, the width of the front was smaller, with smaller gaps between strong points. Tanks were also located further back because there was not sufficient time for tanks to dig in. There was also less construction of trenches and obstacles, as well as less employment of mines in the hasty defense. The defenses had similar dispositions of units and strong points. Cuban defensive doctrine stressed the need to avoid establishing any set pattern and called for changing the pattern of defensive employment as often as possible. However, because of the extensive preparations, few significant changes were implemented once the units were dug in. We will see, however, how cleverly this policy was changed in the days leading up to the Tumpo battle. The defense was organized in depth. Each maneuver unit from platoon up to division usually was organized 2 on line and 2 in back. That is, a platoon would have 2 squads on line and 1 behind. Let us look at figure 30 in detail. Even though this was a mechanized platoon, the motorized layout looks the same, except that it would exclude the armored personnel carriers, as the soft-skinned trucks would be parked some distance to the rear. We can see 2 squads in permanent fortifications up to 200 meters apart, covering a frontage of up to 400 meters wide, with the RPGs at the outside flanks. The third squad would be deployed 10 meters deeper to the rear, covering the gap between the 2 front squads, also from a permanent fortified position, with their RPG on the flank. Notice where the APCs would be dug in, also in permanent positions from where it could provide supporting overhead fire to its squad, as each BTR-60 PB had a 14.5mm heavy machine gun in its turret. Notice the overlapping sectors of fire. All 3 squads could be forward next to each other. All squads would be in fortified positions. Barbed wire, minefields and other obstacles would be placed in front and covered by fire. Looking at figure 31 in detail, we see it is a tank platoon of 3 tanks in defensive positions, unsupported and on its own. Again, we see the 2 tanks in front up to 200 meters from each other, covering a 400-meter frontage, with a third one just over 100 meters deeper and behind. All 3 tanks could be forward. The tanks would be in defilade. Barbed wire, minefields and other obstacles would be placed in front and covered by fire. Tank platoons behind the FIBA probably would not be dug in to retain mobility, but it had been noted in previous engagements that most tanks in a deliberate defense would be in defilade, able to fire on approaching enemy from a hold-down position, almost like a small, immobile bunker. Unserviceable tanks were often dug in like this in order for them to add their firepower to the overlapping fields of fire of the overall defense, if still able to traverse and fire. Notice that each tank would have had at least 2 alternative positions already prepared. Unsupported tanks on their own would quickly fall prey to an enemy's portable anti-tank weapons in our scenario. Hard lessons have taught them to always deploy infantry with tanks. This brings us to figure 32, a reinforced tank company's defensive positions. We see a tank company of 10 tanks, reinforced with an infantry company of 3 platoons, mutually supporting each other from deliberate defensive positions. Notice how even in this combined, mutually supportive defense, both the infantry platoons and the tank platoons maintained that 2 up front, 1 behind principle, with the infantry in front of the tanks and the tanks providing overhead supporting fire. All infantry would be dug in, and the tanks may also be in defile, but they essentially remained mobile. Variations here, again, was to keep unserviceable tanks still capable of firing in these default positions. The company commander maintained a centralized position for the purposes of exercising command. Again, all tanks have alternative positions that they could quickly move to if required. While the figure does not indicate it as such, the dug-in infantry would also have had alternative positions. These alternative positions mostly covered the rear of the position, just in case an enemy managed to slip past and attack from the rear. Notice the anti-tank minefields covering the flanks of the position. Notable items included the line for opening fire at point-blank range, the predefined reference points, and predefined areas of concentrated tank fire, indicating the subunit responsible for that particular area. As always, all approaches to the position were covered by overlapping fields of fire. In some situations, all three maneuver elements may either have been online or one may have been forward and two behind, as per figure 33. In some cases, platoons and companies may have been organized three online with a small reserve. For maneuver units of the battalions, regiments and divisions which were on the front lines, the units nearest the FIBA were in the first echelon, and those units behind them were in the second echelon. Both echelons were considered committed. Thus, a regiment in our scenario, a brigade, usually would have had two battalions in the first echelon and one in the second echelon. The battalions were the basic component of the defensive organization, figure 33. Reserves and dedicated anti-tank units were found at battalion level and above. Small reserve forces occasionally were organized at company level. Let us work through the figure from top to bottom. Note how there were planned zones for artillery barrages some 500 to 1000 meters in front of every prepared position, even dummy positions, as well as zones for concentrated artillery fire on possible approach routes near dummy positions as well as forward positions likely to collapse first under enemy pressure. In this case, the forward position of one platoon of the 3rd Mechanized Company. The main company positions, one in front and two behind, in this case, were all fortified and all had anti-tank minefields covering their fronts, even the battalion command post. While the companies had been deployed in a one up front, two behind formation, each company maintained a two up front, one behind platoon formation, or just a two up front formation within its company position, as in the case with reduced companies, whose third platoons had been deployed in a forward position or some mobile reserve with a tank platoon in the rear. The gaps between platoons were covered by anti-tank guns or anti-tank guided missiles. Each company commander had an observation post from where he could observe developments and control his men from. I just noticed that the battalion's mortar battery was deployed just behind the main company position to allow for defensive fire support. There were two firing lines for planned tank counterattack positions by the attached tank platoon which was kept in the battalion reserve. The anti-aircraft artillery battery could be found behind the battalion commander's position. A howitzer battery had been attached for direct fire support of the battalion and had been deployed in the rear from where it could lay down barrages or concentrated fire in their planned zones. All rear services of the battalion were deployed away from the main fighting. This would include recovery, maintenance, medical supplies, transport, etc. As to our scenario for the area in dispute, I have previously indicated that we relate the Angolan brigade to the Cuban regiment to be at the same level. This implied that the combined Cuban Fapla forces in the area in dispute could be regarded as similarly functional and organized at the same level as a typical Cuban infantry division. In this sense, our division now comprised of a forward command post, some divisional assets, a Cuban regiment, and essentially 4 Angolan brigades. Each maneuver unit on the FIBA from company to division would establish at least one security post over which they had operational control. For example, The company would establish a reinforced squad outpost within 500 meters of its frontline units. A battalion could establish a reinforced platoon outpost within about 2,000 meters of its frontline units. A regiment, or in our case a brigade, would establish a reinforced company outpost within 3 to 6 kilometers of its frontline units. The forward detachment was a mobile combined arms team, which usually had tanks as well as attached engineer and artillery assets. Unlike the security outposts, which would establish static positions, the forward detachment would aggressively try to engage the enemy. Unit commanders would usually place their forward command post behind the center of the first line or echelon of their unit. For example, a division commander normally would locate his forward command post just behind the first echelon regiment. The division main command post would be located with the division's second echelon units. Commanders at all levels were expected to conduct personal reconnaissance. Coordination and communications were established with adjacent higher and lower units. Each unit, especially those on or near the front lines, would establish well dug-in, camouflaged, fortified positions with strong points that were capable of 360 degrees defense. Communications trenches connecting frontline positions were usually dug, and overhead cover was normally provided for bunker entrances, troop shelters, individual foxholes, and machine gun emplacements. Minefields and obstacles were established especially in front of the FIBA and were also in place throughout the entire defensive organization, including the areas between the defensive belts, and were covered by observation and fields of fire. Alternate and dummy positions were established too, all units establishing interlocking fields of fire and obstacles with adjacent units. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery pieces of the first echelon battalions and regiments normally were dug in. Those behind the first echelon regiments were more mobile. Cuban forces retained a small mobile reserve at battalion level and above. The reserve unit was usually a reinforced unit, 2 levels below the parent unit. For example, the battalion normally had a reinforced platoon as its reserve force, and a regiment or brigade had a reinforced company. The reserve force was usually taken from the second echelon of the parent unit and was composed of tanks and or mechanized infantry. Reserves at the battalion and regiment level were usually positioned with or near the second echelon of the parent unit, although they might have been placed just behind the first echelon. Some infantry divisions had a tank regiment, which usually would supplement the division reserve. The division reserve, which was usually tank heavy, was normally located near the second echelon regiments or brigades. Plans for launching counterattack forces were made at every level, beginning with companies, and were part of the initial defensive planning. Although the reserve unit usually was the principal counterattack force, other units may have been used, particularly those in the second echelon. Counterattack forces usually contained tanks and mechanized infantry units. Normally, the authority of the next superior commander was required before the counterattacks could be launched. The counterattacks usually consisted of fire from all types of weapons, followed by infantry attacking from a different direction. In the counterattack, the Cubans would try to gain surprise with a flank attack while the enemy was reorganizing, or would counterattack at night, which was not likely in our scenario, given the size of the Angolan component of the division. Each maneuver unit from platoon up planned anti-tank defenses which included obstacles and mines. Anti-tank weapons included tanks, the RPG-7 which was issued to each squad, Snapper and Sagger anti-tank guided missiles, and 57mm, 76mm and 85mm guns, which were organic to infantry and mechanized infantry battalions. If necessary, field and anti-air defense artillery weapons could be used in anti-tank defense, such as the 23mm ZSU-23-2. Anti-tank defenses and weapons were located along likely avenues of approach, into which the Cubans would try to channelize the enemy to form killing zones. While Sagger anti-tank guided missiles, packed in their little suitcases, were plentiful and part of the standard armory of the integral anti-tank elements of the typical battalion. It was quickly discovered much earlier in the war that this weapon, while extremely effectively used against Israeli tanks in the open desert in 1973, was rather useless in the Angolan bush. The guiding wires would get caught up in the thick bush, causing the missile to veer out of control. In 1975, a South African soldier had described the scene after a battle as follows. It looked as if the post office was installing new telephones. The Cubans planned for extensive use of artillery in defensive operations. In addition to the artillery organic to mechanized infantry and armored regiments and divisions, the Cubans would assign regiment artillery groups, RAGs, or brigade artillery groups, BAGs, in our scenario, and divisional artillery groups, DAGs, composed of artillery pieces from corps and army assets. Fire plans were carefully organized and control was highly centralized. Artillery fire was concentrated against the enemy's most important forces, against key targets in the enemy's rear, and to cover the flanks of Cuban units. The Cubans stressed the ability to shift fires rapidly. They believed that effectiveness of fire in the defense is achieved by surprise and accurate, massed use of artillery fires. This certainly was their main strength during the defense of the Tumpo Triangle in our area of dispute, as we shall see. If you had to study the basic organization of a Cuban infantry division in the defense, it is easy to see the relationship between Angolan brigades and Cuban regiments, and that the forward command post at Cuito Carnaval served all the purposes and was at the same level as a Cuban divisional headquarters. Maybe not as extensive, but very similar. By looking in detail at how such a Cuban division would conduct the defense, we would come to understand how the Angolan equivalent, now under Cuban command anyway, would function. Let us study Figure 36, the basic organization of the infantry division in defense, in detail, and look at how it was applied to the Angolan formation. We can see the division would be deployed over a frontage of between 6 to 12 kilometers, with a depth of 6 to 10 kilometers. This was known as the Division Defense Zone, which covered the area up to the forward edge of the battle area, FIBA. The Division Defense Zone formed the main defense belt, which would comprise of two echelons, the first being the regiment echelon and the second being the division echelons. There would be three defense lines, with the first defense line and the second defense line falling within the regiment echelons, and the third defense line falling under the division echelons. How does this fit into our area in dispute? Let us have a look. The division defense zone, as it has been overlaid on the map, is more or less 8 kilometers wide at a depth of about 7 kilometers. Almost a perfect fit for a deliberate area defense of Cuito Carnaval and the Tumpo Triangle. As we continue, we will see how this could have been translated into a solid textbook defense as per Cuban doctrine. Let us leave the defense zone demarcation there for a moment. For those who may have noticed, there is another zone forward of the main defensive zone, called the security zone, which may stretch out as far as 15 kilometers further away from the FIBA. In this division security zone, there would firstly be a screening force. These were troops from a division reconnaissance battalion, which would make contact with the enemy about 8 to 16 kilometers in front of the FIBA. They would fall back under pressure without becoming decisively engaged and would pass through the regimental security forces. Screening forces would also direct long-range artillery and airstrikes against attacking forces. Secondly, there would be a security force. After withdrawal of the screening force, the regimental security force, supported by air and artillery strikes, would conduct a stubborn holding action. When further resistance was considered unprofitable, the division commander would order a withdrawal through the first echelon regiments to the second regiment echelon. As the enemy pressure increases, the battalion and company security forces would also be withdrawn. In our area in dispute, the Cuba Fapla force had been in their defense zone for months. Occasionally, small reconnaissance teams would be sent out to pinpoint the exact locations of UNITA screening forces and especially the much sought after South African artillery OPOs, who would bombard the slightest movement with 155mm airburst shells, thus making reconnaissance almost impossible. Small scouting teams would fall foul of the UNITA guerrillas, spread through the entire area, and many never returned to report on what they may have discovered. Two of these scouts passed through my OPO position one night. We heard them moving past and remained deadly quiet, and they were both shot by UNITA soldiers some distance behind us. Sometimes a combined force would do a reconnaissance in strength and assault a nearby high point in order to clear a suspected OPO position. This they did quite effectively a couple of times by clearing that most obvious observation point on the high ground between the two rivers, the delta as we called it, and the resident OPO and his protection element had to disengage and disappear into the bush in order to evade the route visitors. On the day before the Tumpo 3 attack, an intercept suggested that Fapla intended to regain control of the Shambinga high ground, which was where my observation post was located. Fortunately for my small little team, this was preempted by the fact that you could already hear the South African tanks moving closer to the assembly areas to the northeast, and therefore this attack did not materialize. A deep reconnaissance patrol was sent out by Fapla on 5 March to locate the South African forces east of the Quito. 3-2 Battalion was then deployed to prevent any Fapla reconnaissance activity in or through the area. It is clear that the so-called screening force did not function very well, and deployment in the security zone was essentially limited to forward positions, which is 3 to 6 kilometers ahead of the FIBA. In our area in dispute, we can see the forward positions would be just south and southwest of the high point at 1,234 meters south of the Dala River. 2 reinforced companies would have been deployed in fortified positions. Note that these forward positions were also protected by anti-tank minefields, something that played a key role during the Battle of 23 March 1988. Immediately forward of the FIBA would be an extensive anti-tank minefield belt, covering the entire frontage of the first defense line. In our area in dispute, the FIBA would actually not have been a straight line, but would have curved to the south on the eastern side, with anti-tank minefields here as well. Warning minefields were placed on all feasible approaches, with 5 mobile tanks deployed between 2 outposts placed well forward of the main defensive positions. Now we get to the first defense line, which contained the first full combat elements of the main defense belt, based on battalions. Here each regiment deployed its 2 full battalions into fortified positions, facing outwards across the FIBA and the minefields, while more anti-tank minefields covered the outside flanks, and anti-tank weapons covered the gaps between the battalions. Both regimental command posts are centrally located, while a forward control post of the division also formed part of this first line defense. This would be in direct communication with the division's main command post in the third defense line. In our area in dispute, the 3 battalions of Fapla's 25 Brigade made up the entire first defense line, as we can see, and each battalion also provided a reinforced company as a forward position outside the FIBA. A battalion of 36 Brigade formed part of the first defensive line overlapping the delta. The infantry of Fapla's 25 Brigade was dug in well-prepared trench lines stretching from the Kwanavaal to the Tumpo. Apparent gaps in the positions were covered by at least 5 23mm guns and 10 82mm B-10 recoilless anti-tank guns, sighted to enfilade any force that attempted to penetrate them. 5 Grad Ps were also deployed in the main 25 Brigade positions. 10 tanks were in prepared hold-down firing positions behind the infantry positions. The second defense line in the Cuban division defense would contain the 3rd battalions of the individual regiments, also dug into fortified positions, and the regimental artillery groups (RAG) of each regiment. This would also contain each regiment's reserve. In our area in dispute, 2 battalions of Fapla's 66 Brigade made up the second defense line, which also contained all the artillery assets of the deployed brigades in what we could call brigade artillery groups, BAGs. Yes, something unusual had happened. To reduce the vulnerability of the guns against the immense firepower and reach of the South African G555mm guns, the batteries were no longer deployed as firing batteries, but rather as single guns or in pairs. This was possible because the tactical situation did not require the artillery to be highly mobile or regularly redeployed. Each gun was allocated a clear field of fire over the Tumpo area, and every possible potential target was pre-registered, with every gun able to concentrate on those points individually, either directly or indirectly. This way all possible approaches had been covered. Each minefield was carefully plotted and registered as a target, allowing all guns in the sector to concentrate their fire on that single point if it should become necessary. The 3rd Battalion of 66 Brigade would have probably been incorporated into the brigade reserves and is not indicated as deployed on any map that I have seen. Frankly, I have no idea what happened to it. The main difference with that of the Cuban division that we will notice is that the Angolan higher formation did not have regiment boundaries in the same way as a Cuban division would have had, clearly defining the different areas of responsibility for each regiment. We see that one Angolan brigade's battalions almost exclusively made up the first defensive line, while a second Angolan brigade made up the second defense line. This means that the different brigades were echeloned, belonging to different echelons. In an interesting variation from the Cuban defense doctrine, another extensive anti-tank minefield was laid as an additional barrier between the first defense line and the second defense line. This was obviously a measure to counter the formidable South African Olifant tanks, should they manage to break through the outer minefields and the first defensive line. These anti-tank mines were boosted with additional blocks of RDX TNT packed below each anti-tank mine to make sure to damage the Olifant suspension system in order to immobilize them to become static targets for the array of artillery employed in the anti-tank role as part of the BAGs. 922mm D30 guns were deployed about 100 meters behind the main positions, waiting for Olifant tanks to break through the minefields. Note that these guns were not deployed as batteries, but as single guns in a direct fire role. The Divisional Artillery Group, DAG, made up part of the 3rd Defence Line. All artillery assets that could not be deployed, as well as the higher command artillery assets, formed part of this group, and was usually composed of long-range artillery and multiple rocket launchers. In our area of dispute, strong artillery elements were deployed all over the high ground on the west bank as part of the DAG, from where they could very effectively place observed fire on all approaches to the Tumpo Triangle. The Divisional Artillery Group, DAG, made up part of the 3rd Defence Line. All artillery assets that could not be deployed, as well as the higher command artillery assets, formed part of this group, and was usually composed of long-range artillery and multiple rocket launchers. In our area in dispute, strong artillery elements were deployed all over the high ground on the west bank as part of the DAG, from where they could very effectively place observed fire on all approaches to the Tumpo Triangle. Finally, all the remaining divisional assets would make up the rest of the 3rd Defence Line. This would have included the main command post, the remaining regiment of 3 battalions with its command post and its reserve, an anti-tank reserve unit of anti-tank guns, wire-guided anti-tank missiles and/or tanks, and possibly a tank regiment, if available. It would also contain the division reserve disposition area and rear services. In our area in dispute around the town of Cuito, we found that 2 Angolan battalions remained to form part of the 3rd Defence Line, both battalions from 13 Brigade, one covering the approach from the south on the western side of the Cuito River, and the other the western approaches towards the town. Another important and independent part of this defence line was the Cuban regiment. The Cuban regiment itself was reorganized as a tactical combat group, 71 Grupo Táctico, 71st Tactical Group, under Colonel Avilio Guerrero, comprising of 3 detachments. Uno destacamento de combatante del 7 Grupo Táctico, one combat detachment, possibly under Lieutenant Colonel Venancio Avila. Dos destacamento de combatante de 7 Grupo Táctico, two combat detachment, possibly under Lieutenant Colonel Reinaldo Banos and First Lieutenant Roberto Reynoso Rodriguez. Tres destacamento de combatante del 7 Grupo Táctico, third combat detachment, possibly under Lieutenant Colonel Taurinian Nanes and First Lieutenant Cruzata Jorge A. Ramirez. Battalion de Tanques, that's a tank battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Ciro Gonzalez and First Lieutenant Danilo Revilla Martinez. While some minor elements have been deployed with the Angolan brigades on the eastern side of the river, the bulk of the 71st Tactical Group remained on the western side of the river, and thus in the 3rd Defence Line. The original Tactical Group 2, now consisting mainly of the partly Cuban manned 3-tank battalion, was in the breach area as a mobile reserve and destruction force. It had at least 14 tanks. To quickly summarize the basic organization of the infantry division in the defense, as implemented for the defense of Quito Carnaval and the Tumpo Triangle. A. The security zone. B. The anti-tank minefields. C. The first defensive line behind the FIBA. D. The second defense line. E. The divisional artillery grouping, DAG. F. The third defense line. This concludes the second part of the presentation about the Cuban Fapla organization and deployments at Quito Carnaval. I would like to invite you to view the third part tomorrow, same time, same browser. I hope you found this presentation insightful and that I have managed to create a deeper understanding of the size, nature, organization and deployment of the Cuban Fapla force. Even more interesting parts are still to come. Tomorrow we will look at the size, organization and deployment of the SADF UNITA forces. I hope you will be able to attend. Thank you.